Thanks, Kaori, and thanks for putting this together. Welcome everyone to the second day of the Fables workshop. We have two speakers in this first session. The first is Chris Danta from University, or the Australian National University now, where he has the very intriguing title of Professor of English in the School of Cybernetics. Chris and I actually edited a special issue of Substance Journal on Derrida's Beast and the Sovereign lectures, I think about a decade ago now, the title of which was Fabled Thought. So this has been a sort of a long-standing interest. And Chris's ARC Future Fellowship project is titled Future Fables, Literature, Evolution and Artificial Intelligence. He's also the author of two books, including Literature Suspends Death on Sacrifice and Storytelling in Kierkegaard, Kafka and Blanchot, and Animal Fables After Darwin, Literature, Speciesism and Metaphor, which I think is required reading for all of us. So his paper today is titled Anthropocene Fables.
Thanks very much, Matt. I just wanted to say thanks so much to Kaori as well for organising this network. And Kaori recalled it yesterday. It's still very vivid in my memory of us meeting in Kent and realising that we both worked on Fables. And it's amazing to to see this come to fruition. I think we both thought we were lonely souls working on a strange topic, but now it's coming, becoming more popular. And I remember as well when I was reading some of Kaori's book, today, and I remember when I got reviews of my book from the press, sort of manuscript reviews, they sort of said, could you focus more on the post-colonial, or could you say more about the post-colonial? I was just thinking today, I wish I could have just said you could read Kaori's book. It wasn't sort of out just then, but it does such a great job in that space. And so it's just fantastic to sort of be in a community around the Fable and to be part of these workshops. And also, I guess, to be with people whose work has influenced me so much. A lot of people in this workshop of, your work has been deeply influential in my thinking about the Fable. Just before I begin as well, I wanted to give an acknowledgement of country, something we do in Australia, and just say that I'm speaking from the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'll start sharing my screen now. So as Matt mentioned, the title is Anthropocene Fables, The Blue Fox in Sjón and Jeff VanderMeer. This is kind of a taster sort of paper. I won't have time to talk about both authors. It's sort of based on a paper I've just got forthcoming, if you can see at the top of that slide, The Blue Fox, Cryptic Storytelling and Non-Human Mimicry in the work of Sjón and Jeff VanderMeer. And this is kind of, I guess, a presentation of the theoretical spine of that essay. It's a kind of very long essay and deals with both authors. And it doesn't actually deal directly with the Fable. So what I wanted to do is kind of reflect a bit, especially at the end of the paper, on how the Fable is relevant. And they both are fabulous authors. And what's interesting about this connection between Sjón, who wrote The Blue Fox, and Jeff VanderMeer, who did the sort of Bourne novels, is that VanderMeer actually takes this character of the Blue Fox out of the Blue Fox and into his story world. And it's really interesting. So they both write about fables in different ways and, have a connection. But I won't have time today to talk about VanderMeer, how VanderMeer uses the fable. I just wanted to start by reading the opening of The Blue Fox, which is Icelandic title is Skagabalda, which we'll see is a sort of folkloric monster. This is how the very poetic text begins. Blue foxes are so curiously like stones that it is a matter for wonder. When they lie beside them in winter, there's no hope of telling them apart from the rocks themselves. Indeed, they're far trickier than white foxes, which always cast a shadow or look yellow against the snow. A blue vixen lies tight against her stone, letting the snow drift over her on the windward side. She turns her rump to the weather, curls up and pokes her snout under her thigh, lowering her eyelids till there's the merest hint of a pupil. And so she keeps an eye on the man who has not shifted since he took cover under the overhanging drift here on the upper slopes of the AHRC-funded. Some 18 hours ago, the snow has drifted and fallen over him until he resembles nothing so much as a hump of ruined wall. The creature must take care not to forget that the man is a hunter. Really, this whole essay that I've written comes out of this fascination I have with this opening passage from the Blue Fox. What fascinates me is this phenomenon that it's exhibiting. The blue fox is doing something called background matching. So it's hiding by matching its background. In ethology, this ability of an animal to avoid detection by blending in with its environment is known as crypsis. According to the zoologist Donald Quick, the vast majority of animals defend themselves from predation by making it hard for predators to detect them. In evolutionary terms, natural selection has favored those traits that reduce the probability of detection by predators. And the commonest, there are various forms of crypsis, but the commonest is background matching, where an animal kind of becomes invisible by matching its physical background. And something fascinating about background matching is initially it's a sort of problem of perception. And crypsis or background matching counteracts this perceptual mode called figure-ground segregation. So when we look at a visual scene, we often separate that scene into sort of figures and backgrounds. And what the background matching does is that it's a creature trying to confuse that visual perceptual system. So making it impossible for us to tell, when we're looking at a scene, what is a figure and what is sort of background. So this is what the fox instinctively knows what to do to protect itself. What's interesting is crypsis, initially is this kind of perceptual problem, but, it's also kind of can be explained as a problem of identity. So I've found a number, I just want to sort of go through a number of humanists who have kind of used crypsis as an illustration of a kind of problem of identity. So, when background matching, an organism appears to give up its individual identity to take on the identity of the thing it imitates. If the biological mimic's model is an inanimate object, as is the case with the blue fox, the mimic's ontological allegiance seems to pass at this moment from the realm of the animate to the inanimate. So what's fascinating about background matching when it's an object that's being mimicked is that the creature seems to imitate sort of being inanimate at that moment. And the French thinker Roger Caillois was fascinated by this phenomenon of crypsis. I just want to sort of go through a few people who've kind of reflected really interestingly on this phenomenon of background matching. And he writes, among distinctions, there is assuredly none more clear-cut than that between the organism and its surroundings. So this is exactly what crypsis or background matching confuses. At least there is none in which the tangible experience of separation is more immediate. And Caillois was fascinated by background matching because he saw it as undermining that distinction between organism and surrounding. We could say figure and ground. So for him, background matching expresses a tendency of the living organism to return to the inanimate. But Akiko Bush, the art historian, the American art historian, reads it sort of completely differently. And I find this is interesting that people sort of read the same phenomenon in totally different ways. So in contrast to Caillois, Bush marvels at how cryptic organisms fit into their physical environment and thus model to their human observers a sense of planetary belonging in the time of global warming. So Bush writes of a pebble plant that, a plant that resembles a collection of pebbles that was gifted to her by her husband. It conveyed a message about finding accommodation in our surroundings, its botanical ingenuity revealing something about the beauty, valor, and imagination of going unseen. So while, Caillois reads it very negatively, she's reading it positively. It sort of suggests belonging to place. And, I think we can see a problem with Caillois' analysis, like the problem that I have with it is that it seems sort of simplistically and anthropocentrically equates individuality with life and de-individuation with death. So when the cryptic organism is imitating a stone like the blue fox, it seems to sort of de-individuates itself and sort of acts dead in a way. But why should we equate cryptic de-individuation with death when it enables a prey animal to avoid being attacked by a predator? And why, moreover, figure space as disorientating and dislocating as Caillois does when it allows the cryptic organism to avoid detection? So the problem is basically Caillois sort of detaching crypsis from its functional aspect. And then he sort of misconstrues the role that the physical environment plays in the process, isn't it? So what he fails to appreciate is an organism can only disappear into its visual background because it's highly adapted to a particular microenvironment. So I think Bush is right. I mean, when organisms background match, they hide and they show their sense of adaptation to place. And that's a very positive thing. So we can sort of say that cryptic background matching involves two perceptual illusions. You know, the first one is the one that Kaori focuses on, the illusion of the inanimate organism becoming inanimate. But there's also another illusion, I think, the illusion of the inanimate environment becoming animate. So Kaori only sort of focuses on the first of these illusions. So simulating an aspect of its inanimate background causes the mimic to lose its sense of individuality and vitality. He writes, the feeling of personality considered as the organism's feeling of distinction from its surroundings, of the connection between consciousness and a particular point in space, cannot fail in these conditions to be seriously undermined. So the sort of organism just loses all sense of its identity. And Kaori calls this experience depersonalization by assimilation to space. But, you know, I think this is only really half the story. Couldn't we equally say that crypsis expresses the tendency of the inanimate environment to return to a state of animation? So when we suddenly see the blue fox, say, moving, or a hidden creature moving, then it almost seems like the environment comes to life. This is how Amitov Ghosh begins The Great Derangement, his well-known book on climate change. He reads sort of instances of cryptic behavior in this way. So here's another theorist. Who can forget these moments, those moments when something that seems inanimate turns out to be vitally, even dangerously alive? As for example, when an arabesque in the carpet is revealed to be a dog's tail, which if stepped upon could lead to a nipped ankle, or when we reach for an innocent looking vine and find it to be a worm or a snake, when a harmlessly drifting log turns out to be a crocodile. So what's interesting is he begins the book with these instances of cryptic behavior. And then moments when an animal reveals itself. So this is the sort of second illusion I'm talking about. So when the hidden organism emerges from its camouflaged state by moving, it can strike a human observer that the perceptual background itself, the landscape, the environment, the planet, has come to life and started to act as a single organism. And this is because the camouflaged organism seems to act in a depersonalized way, not as an individual organism, but rather as part of the environment. So what's fascinating, I think, is that if we start generalizing identity from the individual to sort of a depersonalized sense of identity, then crypsis becomes something quite interesting and positive. And for Ghosh, one of the uncanny effects of the Anthropocene, this age of the humans where our sort of imprint is being registered in the geological record, is a renewed awareness of the elements of agency and consciousness that humans share with many other beings, and even perhaps the planet itself. He writes, I do believe it to be true that the land here is demonstrably alive, that it does not exist solely or even incidentally as a stage for the enactment of human history, that it is itself a protagonist. What I'm suggesting here is that he's using crypsis as a kind of metaphor to explain what's happening in the Anthropocene, that, when we see the background, the planet suddenly seeming alive, you can explain this with the example of cryptic behavior when an animal suddenly reveals itself from its camouflaged state. So Bruno Latour, I think, is another thinker of the Anthropocene who uses this kind of problem of the distinction between background and foreground to read the Anthropocene in this way. So Ghosh is not alone in arguing that the Anthropocene has forced us to recognize that there are other fully aware eyes looking over our shoulders. This is a central point of Bruno Latour's influential account of the Anthropocene. So he writes, for example, Latour writes in Down to Earth Today, the decor, the wings, the background, the whole building have come on stage and are competing for the actors, with the actors for the principal role. This changes all the scripts, suggests other endings. Humans are no longer the only actors, even though they still see themselves as entrusted with a role that is much too important for them. So what I see Latour doing here is using this kind of perceptual problem of background, the background becoming foreground, cryptic unveiling, to explain the problem of the Anthropocene, what we're experiencing in the Anthropocene. And, in narratological terms, we can start explaining this in sense of how does the background in a literary narrative relate to the foreground. So John McNeill Miller says, for too long, non-human environments have served as the unexamined and under-theorized background of narrative activity. Yet, as a growing number of critics have observed, awareness of ecology in the Anthropocene does away with the easy distinctions between individual agents and static environments. The scenery is shifting beneath our feet, but still we do not have any good sense of how to read it. What I'm saying is Crypsis perhaps gives us a way to read this. Following Miller, John Hegland has proposed analysing such narratives that make material entities and environments characters in the story under the rubric of weird narratology. And this is what Hegland defines by weird narratology. Weird narratology, as I envisage it, is aimed at narratives that foreground a blurring between narrative agents and material entities or environments. So this is what I'm suggesting happens in this kind of process of background matching, where it's part of the environment that the mimic chooses to match. So the vixen's cryptic behavior in the Blue Fox has the effect of bringing what is usually in the background of a realist literary narrative, the physical landscape, a sense of evolutionary, folkloric, and mythical time, into the narrative foreground. Crypsis involves not just a depersonalization by assimilation to space, but also depersonalization by assimilation to time. So in the Blue Fox, it is as if the vixen exists both in the present moment of the hunt and in its evolutionary or methodological past as a result of her cryptic behavior. I'm saying there are uncanny effects, I guess, to this this act of background matching, or if it's as if she brings the evolutionary, mythical, or folkloric past into the present moment to disorientate the man. So I just want to sort of demonstrate this theory that I'm developing here with some reflection on how the fable's involved, how we can think of the fable as being involved in this story. So cryptic creatures use what is at the edge of their receiver's perception to hide themselves. And in the case of the Blue Fox, where the receiver is the human hunter, Balder Skuggason, what is at the edge of the receiver's perception includes fable, myth, and folklore. So there's a kind of strange shift to a more abstract realm after the hunt begins. So Sjón signals the importance of these ancient literary genres to the meaning of his story by titling it Skuggabaldur, which is the name of a well-known creature in Icelandic folklore, according to one of the folk tales involving this monster from which Sjón clearly draws inspiration. A Skuggabaldur has a cat for a father, while its mother is a vixen. They are savage as the demoned harriers or foxes set on by sorcerers to maul other men's sheep. And when shot at, the gun will misfire. There's actually a moment in the story that this kind of folktale he references in the story, because the hunter actually kills the fox with a gunshot, but then the fox comes back to life. The fox can only be killed by a knife, it turns out, in the story. But unfortunately, I just haven't got time to sort of go through the details of the story very well, but I'll just push on. So another reference to the fable here, the cryptic blueness of the fox, the evolutionary characteristic that enables it to resemble a stone, belongs less to the individual animal, the vixen, than to the species, Volpes lagopus. It is a sign, moreover, of this species' adaptation to its local environment over a long period of time. I think the blue fox is the only native mammal of Iceland. It sort of came over in the Ice Age. The narrator presents the character of the vixen to us by immediately making us aware of her evolutionary connection to her surroundings, of how the biological evolutionary past lives on in the historical present, so her adaptation to place, which enables her to hide. The vixen's intimate connection both to the inanimate landscape and to deep or evolutionary time makes it seem like she exists in another temporality to the man. Indeed, the man acknowledges this aspect of the vixen's identity when he thinks of her as a daughter of Reynard, alluding to the red fox trickster figure of the medieval beast fable, Reynard the Fox. So what's interesting, we've been talking about how, say, fables might start from a realistic point of view, might draw on an actual characteristic of the animal, but in some sense, Sjón uses it the opposite way to kind of create this surreal effect. So we move from a very realistic situation to a surreal encounter with a folkloric monster. The mythical or folkloric aspects, elements of the blue fox serve an ecological purpose, I would argue. They re-empower the non-human animal and natural world over the human in the time of the Anthropocene. So what I'm suggesting is, in some ways, this connection that the vixen has to myth and folktale enables her to escape into a kind of mythical past, folkloric past. She transports the man from the human and technological, Sjón, transports the man from the human and technological dominated present of the 19th century to the mythic and folkloric past, so that, like the vixen, he too can experience what it's like to become a cryptic part of the landscape. where the more realistic part one of the blue fox concerns a vixen's assimilation into her environment through her cryptic background matching, the more fantastic part 3, in which the fox begins to talk like a fabulous animal, concerns the man's assimilation into his environment through his fabulous transformation into a fox. So the end of this part of the story is that the human character transforms into a fox. So he's kind of finally assimilated into the environment. So he thinks he's conquered the animal, but the animal, so the environment comes and conquers him in a way. So just to finish off a couple of slides. So Gosh says, what we need is to find a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we're trapped. So this is the problem of the Anthropocene. How do we think beyond sort of individualism? My suggestion is that the process of cryptic de-individuation provides a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we find ourselves trapped by modeling a form of depersonalized environmental subjectivity. So this is what I'm suggesting that the vixen is doing in the story, this bit that I've analyzed. What makes crypsis an ideal phenomenon with which to tell Anthropocene stories is that it blurs the distinction between figure and ground, organism and its milieu, individual and collective agency. So Sjón, I'm suggesting, uses the fable to help the blue fox escape the instrumentalizing human. Fable allows him to change the frame of reference of the narrative present by shifting mode from realism to surrealism, by confusing figure and ground, and by asserting the power of the folkloric past over the historical present. So what I'm suggesting, I guess, in the end is, again, the fable is a way of shifting frame of reference to enable the fox to sort of have a sense of agency and power over the human, which it lacks in the realistic situation of being shot by a hunter. But I just wanted to leave it at that. It's just sort of a taste of the theoretical sort of argument that I'm trying to develop in this paper. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. That was wonderful and amazingly scopic and on time as well. Kaori, did you want to take questions after each paper or at the end?
It's up to you. Do we
maybe we'll see. We've got 5 minutes, I think. Do people have questions for Chris?
Chris, can you say more about the background versus foreground formal point you were alluding to in the course of your talk? That's fascinating to me in terms of its applicability, you know, beyond this text, and in terms of its kind of generalizability in relationship to the representation of the other than human kind of across literary history. But anyway, just any further thoughts on that topic would be terrific.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big theoretical thought, is sort of this idea of foregrounding the background. So what I'm trying to suggest is, by background matching, the fox sort of becomes a part of the background, you know, so what we'd normally perceive as the perceptual background. And then once in that background, sort of becomes an agent for that background to act on the foreground, which is the human character. So, you know, the idea is that we humans are in the foreground, and we're sort of obsessed with the foreground, and we tend to see the background as having no kind of agency over us. But what Sjón's trying to do in the story is showing that the background does have agency over us. And I think what he does is shows how the fox sort of initially assimilates into the background, but then the background or the environment then starts to act upon the human character and to sort of put the human character in its place. And so that there's a sort of, I refer to the AHRC peak. What happens is literally that at the moment the hunter Skaga Balderson sort of shoots the fox, what happens is there's a huge landslide. It's like the mountain comes to life. So, and sort of the man, I just haven't had time to sort of analyze these details, but the man gets swept up into an ice cave. And so it's almost like the background, the environment comes to life at that moment, because he's sort of tried to instrumentalize nature, and then he's sort of punished by the background coming to life. Sort of then he gets trapped in this cave and has this encounter, and then starts talking to the fox. You know, we're not sure if he's hallucinating or not. And so, yeah, I mean, this is an idea I see as having a lot of applicability at the moment in my machines project. I'm sort of saying, well, we tend to see machines as almost coming to life and acting on us, so the background of the machinic background is the technological background is coming to life. And so I think authors, what happens is a lot of authors use that foreground background distinction to think about what it means to be human, and to sort of reverse that traditional distinction where the foreground would have the agency and the background would be inanimate and non-agential. And so, so I see these stories, and VanderMeer does it too. So, I mean, I'm sort of trying to trace a lot of authors at the moment who try to bring the background, the perceptual background to life in order to act on the human. Does that,
Yeah, super exciting. Thank you, especially the turn to agency and the whole problematic of agency in literary form. Really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Susan's hand is up.
Just to press you a little further with the historical question, fantastic paper, by the way. I'm really looking forward to reading the full version of it. I'm wondering how, though, this blending into the background in literary history has signaled something bad happening. So the big example that comes straight to mind is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's yellow wallpaper, when blending into the background signals madness, right? Or even Jim Craig, liberatory for the human to become novel at the decomposition one, where it's just a human corpse. So I think for animals this change might be different, animal characters than would be for human characters, but maybe I'm missing something because I'm not
Sorry, you broke up a bit there, Susan, but I think I got the. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I think you're definitely right. I mean, something that came to mind is a text that I don't really look at a lot in this essay, but Jeff VanderMeer's Annihilation, where the human characters, sort of perish by getting sort of become made part of the Area X or whatever in that story. But yeah, I don't want to suggest that this is a sort of one sort of size fits all sort of way of of doing things. It's just a pattern I've noticed in certain authors. And I mean, I think the thing to probably emphasize in relation to what I was talking about with the fox is I think it's quite important that there's an actual connection between the vixen, the blue fox, and the environment that it's in. So, in this case, it all hinges on that. It's not sort of just abstract. The thing I find problematic about Kaori is that he just abstracts everything to such an extent that nothing has any connection to place. So where he says assimilation to space, I would say assimilation to place, and if that relation to place is genuine and positive, it can be a positive thing. But if it can be, you can imagine all sorts of violent, stories you could tell by not making that a positive relation. And so I'm not suggesting it's just a one sort of theoretical lens to look at all these stories with. It's just a certain type of story. Yeah.
All right, well, we'll take one last question from Erica and then move on.
Hi, thanks, Chris. That was a really, really interesting paper. I was thinking of early modern discussions of sight hounds and scent hounds, and just wondering how far the visual camouflaging that you're talking about could be taken as in some way a particularly anthropocentric version of camouflage. Because obviously there are animals who would be smelling out the invisible creature or the invisible to us. So I'm sorry if that sounds critical. It's not. Your paper has made me really think, but it struck me as a thing.
Yes, yeah. And I mean, there are, to sort of expand on the idea of crypsis, there are sort of other sensory types of crypsis. So, animals, deceive other animals in all sorts of ways. What's interesting, though, is from what I could tell, reading quite a lot of the research on crypsis, still it's the visual that's the focus of a lot of animals in inter-animal, sort of deception, if you know what I mean. It's not just humans that are deceived in those ways, insects and other animals sort of deceive each other in visual ways. But there are, oral ways as well, and sound, like all sorts of all sorts of ways that crypsis manifests. So yeah, I mean, what I find interesting is in these stories, I'm trying to sort of say there's something about the fact that the human perceiver is at the center of them. So that's why it almost has to be anthropocentric to start with, you know, that you have to sort of start from that, the sense that there's a human perceiver, and it's the sort of focalization is being attached to that, I guess. It'd be interesting to think, you know, you could tell all sorts of stories where that wasn't the case. I could imagine that would be quite tricky, but you could start from you know, scent being the, you know, the focus of a non-human character, you know, in that kind of environment. But yeah, so there's sort of lots of possibilities there. So this is, yeah, very much attached to the fact that my argument relies on the fact that the human perceiver is the one at the center of it, and being, the idea is, I guess, there's a decentering that happens from that. The fact, you know, that there's a transformation. So he's transformed from a highly anthropocentric human to a fox, you know, by the end of the story, having still killed the fox, I should say, as well. The vixen dies eventually too. So yeah. But thanks.
All right,
Thanks,
great.
Eric.
Thanks so much, everyone. And thanks to Chris. I'm sure we're all clapping or knocking on our tables in the comfort of our own offices and homes. Our second speaker for this session is Laura Brown, who is John Wendell Anderson Professor of English at Cornell University. Professor Brown studies uncertainty and innovation, non-human beings and species difference, and gender, empire and race in 18th century literary history. And her recent book, Homeless Dogs and Melancholy Apes, defines the formative impact of non-human beings in English literary history. And Professor Brown's paper is titled Beyond Human, the Counterhuman Force of Fable.
Thanks so much, Matthew. And thanks again, Chris. And I want to apologize for missing yesterday due to insane travel circumstances, but I'm really happy to be here and happy to see folks, especially people I know. Pleased to engage in this conversation. So thanks so much, Carrie, for putting this all together for us. This is going to be a workshop on the idea of the fable in relation to the other than human, animals, things, the environment, and the earth. I'll offer my own definition of the fable as a distinctive manifestation of the relationship between literature and culture formed through an engagement with the other than human, very broadly construed. My examples will come from a close reading of the literary culture of the English 18th century, because for me, this period offers a useful confluence of historical, social, intellectual, and geological and climatic events relevant to humans, animals, and the environment, which variously impact the literary imagination. So I begin with a broad premise that the fable is a literary form that entails a distinctive and powerful engagement with culture, and is thus an especially valuable model for the exercise of literary critique. And here I'm thinking about Hayden White in Beyond the Cultural Turn, who's outlining for us the four premises of this vital congruence of cultural and literary analysis. So he says, first, it's linguisticism. The best way to understand culture is to view it as if it were a language. Next, he says textualism. Reality is a text, and the understanding of it is to be gained only by a technique of examination analogous to the reading of written, spoken, visual, or gestural texts. Next, constructivism. Nothing of reality, whether natural, social, or cultural, is given directly to perception or thought, but is accessible only by way of reflection on the various constructions of this reality produced by processes more imaginary or poetic than purely rational. And finally, discursivism. All knowledge is a product of the processes of human consciousness, more discursive than mimetic. What we apprehend as reality is actually only a reality effect produced by the techniques of discursivization rather than by pure or pre-discursive cognition. So this perspective is aligning the analysis of literature with that of culture and bringing into focus the notion of cultural vitality as an especially crucial point of definition and analysis. My interest in the cultural power of the fable here is an adjustment of the conventional definition of the fable, as you know, as a useful lesson expressed in an other than human voice. First, I'm extending the concept of lesson to the realm of cultural vitality and seeing the fable's representation of a powerful cultural experience as kind of lesson. And in that context, I want to argue that the other than human plays an essential role in the form of the fable. We might understand that role as an extension of the conventional notion of the animal voice. So to summarize, for the purposes of this argument, the fable is a literary form that empowers a distinctive engagement with culture and that attains that power by means of an encounter with the other than human. Even though we can observe the fable in local literary instances, once we focus on its cultural vitality, a fable extends beyond its manifestation in a single text. Here's an example, and I've suggested this elsewhere, the city sewer. Accounts of the city sewer are noticeably prominent in 17th and 18th century literature. These sewer stories can be understood collectively as a vibrant, complex cultural fable emerging from the infrastructural challenges around waste disposal that arose with urbanization, especially in London and Paris. The fable of the city sewer is conspicuous in a set of texts that describe a vivid, visceral engagement with that urban waste. There are some prominent examples, for instance, Ben Jonson's The Voyage Itself, Rochester's A Ramble in St. James's Park, Robert Gould's Love Given O'er, John Gay's Trivia or the Art of Walking the Streets of London, and substantial parts of Pope's Dunciad. These works, individually and collectively, express the encounter with a powerful heterogeneity emerging gradually and then overwhelmingly from a fluid force, occupying a particular urban geography, evoking an omnivorous energy, and ultimately overwhelming established human systems of coherence, hierarchy, or order through a powerful other than human scenario. Gay's urban pastoral poem Trivia, for instance, is a core example. The centerpiece of the first book of the poem is the swelling kennels of London's open sewer system, where these rushing torrents are typically described that belong to this fable of the city sewer. So here's a quote: "When the swinging signs your ears offend with creaking noise, then rainy floods impend. Soon shall the kennels swell with rapid streams and rush in muddy torrents to the Thames." So in all these poems, there's this rushing impetus and flowing motion of the other than human scenario of the urban environment, and it's constant. They characterize the city itself. The pedestrian is urged to swiftly shoot along the crowded streets and warned that this tumultuous tide is going to bear his companion away from him. The flowing energies of the sewer, the rain, and the rushing human and other than human populations are a source of disruption. They soak the people's wigs and clothes. They wreck passing carriages. They mess up the shoes of the ladies. And the powerful presence of the women and female promiscuity is a dimension of this fable. In another account of the city sewer, Robert Gould's Love Given O'er explicitly makes a connection between the flowing sewer with this omnivorous female sexuality, which is epitomizing the heterogeneous confluence of the fable. The poem speaker advises men to choose a woman whose sexual appetite is insatiable and who can absorb male lust into a kind of female sewer that in this image has no shore. So here's another quick quote. "Then choose a wench who, full of lewd desires, can meet your floods of love with equal fires, and will, whene'er you let the deluge fly, through an extended sluice straight drain it dry, that whirlpool sluice which never knows a shore, ne'er can be filled so full as to run o'er, for still it gapes and still cries, 'Room for more.'" Swift's poem, Description of a City Shower, is an influential canonical instance of the fable of the city sewer. depicting the limitless heterogeneity and force of this torrential narrative in the urban geography of the sewer's course from Smithfield to Holborn Bridge. And this will be familiar to you. This is the climax of that poem. Now from all parts the swelling kennels flow and bear their trophies with them as they go. Filth of all hues and odors seem to tell what street they sailed from by their sight and smell. They, as each torrent drives with rapid force from Smithfield or sepulchres shape their course, and in huge confluence joined at Snow Hill Ridge, fall from the conduit prone to Holborn Bridge. Sweepings from butchers' stalls, dung, guts, and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats all drenched in mud, dead cats, and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood. Swift's poem and the fable of the city sewer more broadly are formally implicated with the other than human. They evoke and then promulgate a force outside of human order, human control, or understanding. Here, the trophies that make up this torrential flood express a cumulative other than human scenario. Filth, guts, puppies, sprats replace or even repudiate any orderly human hierarchy or ontology through this torrential engagement with an other than human multitude, which on its own behalf is exerting a collective self-efficacy that we might describe as counterhuman, a form of agency. The sewer's torrent ultimately entails a radical stretching or exceeding of the bounds of conventional human systems of order or representation. But of course, everywhere, even though culture is a human construct, cultural vitality is immersed in, contending with, countered by the other than human. And it's that immersion that challenges us to extend our definition of the fable past the parameters of the human order. So the counterhuman should be seen as a facet of the fable and of its distinctive power. The fable exceeds the exclusively human, even while it's produced through human representation. I want to illustrate this joining of the fable's cultural vitality with its other than human facet by turning to one of the most influential and enduring fables of modern adventure, the castaway survival tale, most famously instantiated in Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Here we are in the presence of one of the most powerful fables of our era and the most often redacted imaginative work of the modern period. Even you're probably aware of the recent film, The Martian, which is demonstrating the currency of this fable story. It's exactly Robinson Crusoe on Mars. Matt Damon is the castaway, Mars is the desert island, and then all kinds of things are assembled that come to populate this empty landscape. In its own time, the profusion of imitations of Robinson Crusoe started in the year after its publication and continued to this minute. The reception of the castaway fable over the years has focused on the human-centered themes of survival, labor, production, accumulation, colonialism, racial hierarchy. And these scenarios suggest the sources of the fable's continuing cultural power. People read the fable because of the hero who's cast away there. But I want to argue here as well that it is the fable's counterhuman dimension that generates the vitality that enacts that power. So using Robinson Crusoe as an example, I want to show that it is the castaway survival fable's immersion in the other than human that enables its cultural power. The fable of the castaway is full of the indiscriminate force of the other than human, even though at the outset those forces are rationalized and managed by reference to human, religious or economic institutions or beliefs. So Robinson Crusoe opens with this, as you remember, set of shifting, intense, vibrant scenes of other than human action, of the storms and the things that he encounters when he first goes to sea, but they're explicitly introduced through reference to the Protestant principle of submission to divine providence. Crusoe rejects his father's advice to settle for the easy circumstances of the middle station of life, and instead he embraces contingency. And the text then pursues activity, adventures, undertakings out of the common road which also evoke a core tenet of venture capitalism and the contemporary financial revolution and the economic engagement with risk as a facet of profit. So these are human, but these complicated, abstract human rationales that seem to motivate the narrative are expressed, I believe, in the castaway survival fable through the vital force of the other than human, a force that in Robinson Crusoe takes over the impact of the novel in the same way that the rapid force of the city sewer's huge confluence takes over the Swift's poem, City Shower. The adventures, rationalized as enterprise, immediately become a self-efficacious end in themselves. In its opening scenes, Robinson Crusoe dramatically and repeatedly enacts these imaginative engagements with energy and force. The sequence of storm scenes that take control of the narrative upon Crusoe's leaving his father's house introduce and immediately highlight this representation of unmoored dynamic activity and counterhuman power. Here's a quote: "The sea went mountains high and broke upon us everywhere, every 3 or 4 minutes. Formally, the account of storm and shipwreck is multifaceted, proliferative, and directionless, an evocation of unstructured, counterhuman turbulence and vitality." And for the human protagonist, confusion, constant confusion of thought. Then, in a move that's very typical of the castaway fable, the arrival at the island suddenly redirects all of this vitality of storms, waves, winds, pirates, monsters, and those get replaced, that form of vitality gets replaced in the narrative by an irresistible self-generative proliferation of objects, other than human things. The castaway survival fable retains the force that's generated by those framing events, the storms and the shipwreck and the monsters or mutinies, but then turns to a focused, imaginative engagement with other than human materiality in the isolation and barrenness of the desert island. This emptiness enables an engagement with objects whose powerful collective self-efficacy is revealed through the counterhuman assemblage. One thing gives rise to another thing in a series that absorbs the attention of the reader as well as the producer, and that then populates Crusoe's island world in an activity that expresses the self-generative force of the counterhuman. Here's the sequence of production of the earthenware pot, beginning with the clay. You have to dig the clay, temper it, bring it home and work it. Then Crusoe makes 2 large earthen ugly things, jars, which next lead to little round pots, flat dishes, pitchers, and pipkins. Then he places 3 large pipkins and 2 or 3 pots in a pile one upon the other, and placed his firewood all around it with a great heap of embers under them. He plies the fire with fresh fuel, and in the morning has 3 very good pipkins and 2 other earthen pots, as hard burnt as could be desired, and one of them perfectly glazed with the running of the sand. It's a proliferation of things. Clay brings forth jars. Next comes a whole lot of little round pots, flat dishes, and pitchers and pipkins, and those then become earthen pots, and those lead to the generation of the mortar and the pestle and the sieve, which is what he makes next. I had made an earthen pot that would bear the fire. My next concern was to get me a stone mortar to stamp or beat some corn in. I resolved to look out for a great block of hard wood, and getting one as big as I had strength to stir, I rounded it and formed it in the outside with my axe and hatchet, and then with the help of fire and infinite labor, made a hollow place in it. After this, I made a great heavy pestle or beater. My next difficulty was to make a sieve. At last, I did remember that I had among the seamen's clothes that were saved out of the ship some neckcloths of calico or muslin, and with some pieces of these, I made 3 small sieves. It's all about activity. It's locally, the energy is portrayed through a gesture toward the contributions of the producer. So Crusoe is narrating it. I applied the fire. But in the broader unfolding of these passages, energy is generated by this rapid sequential emergence of things, one after another, and the energy is absorbed into the things that are its outcome. in the sense that these things themselves, in their like hurried transformation into the next thing, embody an ongoing movement. This fable's representation of counterhuman force on the desert island gives these objects vitality for Crusoe and for the reader. Crusoe's solitary, repetitive, incessant activity enables the irresistible trajectory of the things themselves to dominate the narrative, foregrounding the thingness of the things. And here I'm citing Martin Heidegger, who argues in his essay on the thing, the solitude of the potter promotes the thing-oriented activity of production rather than a human-oriented phenomenon of consumption, leaving the thing as the product of an activity animated by no human aim. And this is the way, as Lynn Festa and many other critics of Robinson Crusoe have noted, the human Crusoe almost weirdly seems to recede from the castaway fable's dramatis personae and gets replaced by the other than human population of the island, all the assembled things. The issue is the discursive prominence of objects in relation to our expectation of human novelistic subjectivity. So I'm quoting Lynn Festa here. What we are given to see of the object constitutes much of what we get of Crusoe's subjectivity. Character emerges through the subjective perception of objects rather than through the transparent depiction of inwardness. The fable of the castaway only seems to be about the human castaway. The narrative initiates this assemblage of things immediately upon the castaway's arrival on the desert island, which at the outset is emphatically barren. Crusoe's first awareness when he, quote, begins to look around me to see what kind of place I was in, results in the observation that, in a word, I had nothing. And this initial context of nothing immediately sets off a frenetic sequence in the assembly of things from the grounded ship. Biscuit, rum, cordial waters, 2 pistols, rusty swords, barrels of powder, 2 saws, an axe, a hammer. And then I now began to consider that I might yet get a great many things out of the ship. I resolved to set all other things apart till I got everything out of the ship that I could get. I brought away several things very useful to me, bags full of nails and spikes, a great skew jack, a dozen or 2 of hatchets, and that most useful thing called a grindstone. Besides these things, I took all the men's clothes that I could find and a spare foretopsail, a hammock, and some bedding. As a site of barrenness, the island directly prompts the assemblage of heterogeneous things. And then, in fact, the island is entirely constituted by the incoming things. The earthen pot, with which I started out, is standing in for the array of things that populate Crusoe's desert island, making it manifest as a world and providing the fable of the castaway with its enduring cultural vitality. By calling attention to the manifestation of the counterhuman here, I'm wanting to demonstrate the essential role of other than human materiality for the fable of the human castaway. Things and the heterogeneous and self-sufficient vitality of their proliferation, or thinging, to use Heidegger's provocative term, is the nature of the castaway fable. This fable illustrates the significance of the other than human to the cultural vitality and the power of the fable, in the sense that the fable can be said to teach a lesson. That lesson here, in this case, is the force of thinging. And this movement beyond the bounds of human order should be, I think, a key component of our definition of the fable, extending our understanding of its cultural power beyond the animal to that whole universe beyond the human. In the English 18th century, we can locate a set of powerful narratives that demonstrate this counterhuman force alongside the castaway survival fable. For instance, we can observe in the stories recounting the love between the lady and her lapdog, a fable that is engaged with cross-species intimacy where human-centered conventions of affinity are replaced with a counterhuman experiment in affective substitution. In the fable of the traveling thing, which has been variously labeled as it narrative or circulation narrative, the whole set of other than human protagonists, pets, mice, banknotes, sedan chairs, overcoats, exhibit an ongoing suffusion with human emotion in a way that ultimately makes the animal or the thing into a human equivalent, challenging or redefining the human ontological assumptions by means of the counterhuman. And meanwhile, the fable of the urban earthquake, a set of accounts of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, strangely transcend conventional disaster discourse in their unwitting tribute to an other than human chaos. And storms, the 18th century is a period of climate change. And the fable of the storm, most prominently describing the Great Storm of 1703 in Western Europe, collectively and powerfully projects the experience of weather through accounts of confluence and turbulence that move all things and beings indiscriminately, reflecting an agency beyond human certainty or control. Across these instances, then, the lesson of the fable is that confutation of human control. The persistent, other than human unconscious of the fable is providing the fullest access to its cultural power. Thanks.
That was wonderful, Laura. Thank you so much. I think we've had two really great papers that I think are quite interesting to think with together as well. Do people have questions for Laura? Kaori?
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great paper. Yeah. I have one question. So I wonder what is your sense of how the counter-human force will try to counter the human effort to tame it. So I'm thinking of the Lucinda Cole's Imperfect Features. She talks about rats in Robinson Crusoe story. So Defoe was able to write about the castaway story by eliminating rats because rats was there on the ship.
Mm-hmm.
And like Alexander Selkirk, the story is based on real story, and then Selkirk was like being harassed by rats.
Mm-hmm.
Defoe chose not to. So there's so many proliferation of things, but there are certain things he chose not to include. But I bet so how that kind of a censorship is actually so what's the relationship between human effort and control it, and how do you have any sense of that?
The thing that's very interesting to me about Robinson Crusoe, I singled out the things as the way to engage or speculate on the status of the other than human in that text. But there's all kinds of animals also. They're the rats that are excluded, and that's just really, really interesting. But then there are populations of animals on the island as well. Mm-hmm. And what the part of the challenge of my approach is that those things, the realm of the other than human isn't explicitly one has to formally develop a methodology that provides for a place for the other than human, even when it's explicitly denied, repudiated, or not really part of the conscious scenario of the author's intention and the text's direct engagement with those things. So there's a route to the other than human that can't go through human creativity or the scenario of human representation. And I think that's a little bit of the challenge that arises and whenever we talk about the fable, because we're so engaged with the role of the other than human animal, but to provide a place for, or to acknowledge the relevance of the other than human without making a claim that it's while meanwhile being very careful not to believe that it's in an intentional dimension of the powerful human author's role in creating the text. That's the methodological challenge for me all the time. There's a kind of unintentionality built into the approach I'm describing to the cultural fable that doesn't ever stop challenging a human critic.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Like that was it was a wonderful paper. I really, I was just sort of excited by the ideas in it. I had a question that about catastrophism. Actually, I've been sort of thinking about catastrophe and catastrophism. I've sort of been writing about last man and last woman stories, which is a kind of version of that, sort of Robinson Crusoe story. And I just wanted to know, is there anything about you want to say about catastrophe in relation to this? Because, I mean, some of those examples you gave sort of related to catastrophe, it just seems like sometimes authors use a kind of sense of catastrophism to almost put the human, to expose the human character to the counterhuman, as you're describing it. And I just, wanted to know if that's something that, you have, something to say about or engage with.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial issue for me. This is all relevant to a book I've been working on, the last part of which begins with animals. So I started out with animals, and my work was primarily on animals, and then somehow the animals led me to the other stuff, like the things and the whole range of other things. But the last dimension of this project was on, as I said, the storms and earthquakes, literary representations of catastrophe in an urban environment, in the case of the Lisbon earthquake. And what's been striking to me is the critiques of the literary analyses of the poetry about the Lisbon earthquake focuses on the common denomination, it focuses on what a lot of critics call disaster discourse. There are certain tropes in representations of catastrophe that are formal and thematic and get repeated all the way across almost every catastrophe poem that you want to read in the 18th century. And there's a kind of commonality that brings them all together and makes them appear to be like powerfully and collectively utilizing the tropes of contemporary literature to express human catastrophe. But if you look very closely at the disaster discourse, it's doing something that it is not intentionally wanting to do. It's trying to, by describing the catastrophe, provide a human perspective that makes sense of it. But if you read it closely, I come to my methodological problem. If I read it closely, I see the disaster discourse as repeatedly coming to a place of multiplicity where there's so much happening, and the power of the disaster is got so much scope that it basically explodes any discursive scenario that might seek to organize it for a reader. And if you read the poem really closely, what you discover is that it's flying apart. It's flying apart formally while it's claiming to manage and control the catastrophe thematically. So there's like a formal and a thematic dissonance happening. And so that's an example of how I'm hoping to utilize, hoping to provide a kind of pragmatic methodology that enables us to take the issue of the counterhuman to the text and put it and discover it there.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, that's a great topic. That's a great topic, and I've fallen in love with catastrophe here.
Thank you so much to everyone, particularly to Chris and Laura. I think we've only got 10 minutes until the next session is supposed to start, so I'll wrap us up there.